Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the kickoff event for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program for North Carolina. I'm so excited that you can join us today. My name is Jen Weiss. I am a Senior Policy Advisor for Climate Change Policy here at NCDOT, and I'm excited to kick off the NEVI program with you. Next slide, please. Before I go into introductions of the team, I did want to say a couple of housekeeping items. We are going to be recording this, so if you have to drop off for any reason, you want to watch it again, or you want to share it with colleagues, we will send out the link after this webinar and you will be able to do that. The other thing I wanted to mention to you is we've got a jam-packed agenda today, so we probably will not have time for questions, but if you do have a question, please drop it into the chat function. You can use the chat function and just send something directly to the staff, and we will respond back to those either online, or we will respond back to you via email after the webinar. We have a lot of people on this. We're going to keep you guys all on mute and keep your cameras off. But again, if you do have questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat. Next slide, please. Oh, not next slide. Sorry, we're on introductions. So yeah, I did want to introduce the team to you all. I'm Jen Weiss, as I said before, but I wanted to introduce you to the rest of the DOT team. Heather Hildebrandt runs our statewide initiatives group here in the Transportation Planning Division. Paula Hemmer also works in the statewide initiatives group, and she's a senior engineer. Maya Hoon is an NC STEM policy fellow that's joined us for a year and has been helping us with the NEVI program. Victoria Blackwell is the environmental justice policy advisor here at NCDOT. And I'd like to introduce you all to Justin Robbins. He is an EV charging planning project manager at HDR, the consulting firm that NCDOT has hired to help us with this process. And Justin is going to be the main presenter here today. So I did want to introduce him to you before I sent it all over to him. Next slide, please. Real quickly, just wanted to give you an update on where we are with NEVI status. As most of you know, we submitted our plan, the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Deployment Plan, to the Joint Office and the Federal Highways Administration back on August 1st, 2022. Our plan was approved in September, and that's opened up the $109 million in federal funding for the program. So behind the scenes since then, we've been working hard to put a plan in place for how to engage with all of you, how to really make a request for proposal process that is going to work for everyone. And Justin's going to go into a little bit of details about the ways that you're going to be able to engage with us, the ways that we are going to be working with all of you going forward. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Justin. Again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to working with you. Justin?
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate that. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Justin Robbins with HDR, and we'll be working alongside North Carolina DOT and the development of this kind of, we'll call it the implementation strategy for our NEVI program. So the agenda for today, really what we're intending to cover is to provide everybody with kind of a base level understanding of knowledge of EVs, some of the barriers to EVs and EV adoption, and then the barriers to that EV infrastructure as well. Provide a brief overview of North Carolina's plans and programs, what's going on outside of just NEVI that you all might be hearing about. So we want to make sure that there's kind of an baseline understanding of what you might see coming down the pipeline that's both NEVI and then some of the other statewide initiatives as well. We want to give an overview of the process and schedule. Basically, what are the opportunities that we have for engagement? How does this fit into the broader context of the development of the infrastructure and where people can get involved? We'll take a review of the opportunities for those market participants, and then we're going to jump into a little bit of the procurement, the request for information or RFI, the request for proposals or RFP, that kind of process and some of the participant involvement, and then we'll talk a little bit about the next steps. So to dive into the first, we'll give a brief overview of electric vehicles. And one of the reasons we do this is kind of recognize that not everybody is probably coming at this from the same spot. So we want to make sure that kind of there's at least a baseline understanding of what we're talking about. And when we talk about EVs, what we're talking about is battery electric vehicles. So these are vehicles that are primarily just grid tied. The battery, they typically have a range between 150 and 400 miles. And these are a little bit different than what you would typically see with a plug-in hybrid vehicle, which would have an internal combustion engine, and they might have a shorter range of 20 to 40 miles, as well as a hybrid electric vehicle, which doesn't have the opportunity to plug in, but it runs primarily off of fossil fuel. So really EVs are what we're talking about here, just because of the type of charging infrastructure and really what that's intended to support. So when we talk about charging, there's 3 levels of charging that are typically referenced. The first one is level 1, and that's a standard outlet. My car is a Chevy Volt with a V, and it's a plug-in hybrid vehicle, which means I can plug it into my standard outlet, and it'll take all night to charge, and only adds, let's say, 40 miles to the range of the vehicle. Level 2 charging is what you generally see in shopping centers. It's what you would have installed in your house from your panel using 220-volt power, which is typically a dryer outlet, for example. And this would charge a vehicle in 200 and up to 250 miles in about 10 hours. It's important to know that this is really intended for kind of destination charging, right? So this is tied to a parking area. You leave your vehicle there, you plug it in, you go into work, you go in for shopping, and then you can add some charge to the vehicle. But really the NEVI program that we'll talk about today is oriented towards level 3, what's called DC fast charge infrastructure, or DCFC. And so DCFC is a lot of power that's being dumped into the battery all at once. That's really intended to facilitate long distance travel, right? So view these as more of a fueling station rather than layover charging that's tied to parking. To give you an example, I mean, you can add 250 miles in 30 minutes. So there's a lot of power that's being distributed into the vehicle with this infrastructure. And so if I'm a planner, so I like to break things down. Level 1, assume that the battery of the vehicle is our swimming pool. Level 1 is like trying to fill a swimming pool with a garden hose. Level 2 is with I'll say a larger garden hose or a fire hose. And then level 3 is really filling that swimming pool with a fire hydrant. So we're delivering a lot of power into that battery, and the infrastructure is significantly different than you would see with level 1 or level 2. It's really intended, again, to get vehicles going on their way quickly and to facilitate long distance travel. So this is what the NEVI program is intended to cover. There's a couple of barriers that we generally recognize with EV adoption. This is nowhere near comprehensive, but again, it's part of that introduction, and it's really shaped the format of the NEVI program is generally what it's intended to address. So you do have range anxiety for longer trips because batteries take a long time to charge. Obviously, if you travel for 400 miles, you would need to charge kind of in the middle of that because the range of the battery is going to be limited, and that's an issue if it takes 6 or 8 hours to charge. So that kind of feeds into this issue of long recharging times. And again, the NEVI program is intended to really bridge that gap and provide high power infrastructure to get vehicles going quickly. And then a lack of charging infrastructure is another component of it as well. This is new, and there hasn't been a lot of effort. I shouldn't say that, I mean, there has, but it's still not as ubiquitous as a regular fueling station. So work is underway around the country to be able to fill the gaps and create different infrastructure, both in terms of destination infrastructure or for DCFC for long distance travel, to make sure that there's kind of a network and a system there to be able to provide travelers with that need. For the implementation barriers, low customer base is something that we have to recognize, is that the market is going to respond when we have a significant penetration of EVs in the fleet. Right now, we're not there yet. And so once that happens, that's going to be kind of a sea change that kind of invites a lot of market participants in to continue building out the infrastructure. And this program is really a way to lay the groundwork for that to happen. We do have gaps in rural areas and underrepresented communities. So, the market wants to put charging infrastructure where there is EVs. But the problem with that is that it does leave gaps. It leaves gaps in rural areas, and it leaves gaps in underserved communities where it might not be economically feasible at the moment to do so, but it still creates some gaps in the system that we have to address. And then weather and extreme temperatures are another component of that. It's a component to the range of an EV and things like charging, just because we have to recognize that there's always going to be those events that seem to be happening at a more regular basis that we have to be able to anticipate and have to make sure that the charging infrastructure is resilient and able to weather those extremes. So I want to take a moment and review some of the other plans and programs that North Carolina has going on at the moment, as well as dig in a little bit into the NEVI plan. So there's a lot of continuing efforts to address emissions, and these are executive orders from the governor's office The first one being kicked off in 2018, EO80, and that really establishes a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40%, and then increase zero emissions vehicles, or ZEVs, registrations up to 80,000 by 2025. In 2022, EO246 was signed, and that really directs agencies to develop the state's Clean Transportation Plan, what's generally called the NCCTP, and that will recommend kind of an actionable set of strategies for decarbonizing the transportation sector. It also updates that goal for a statewide target of 1.25 million electric vehicles registered in the state by 2030, and that accounts for, or should account for, about 50% of those sales total within North Carolina to be electric by 2030. We have Executive Order 271, again passed in 2022, and that instructs the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality to develop the North Carolina Advanced Clean Trucks program. That's really focused on medium duty and heavy duty vehicles. And they will work to develop rules to increase the sales of those vehicles over time, as well as to develop an infrastructure needs assessment to support that transition. And really the program that we're here to talk about today is NEVI. And so again, it's the National Electric Vehicle Initiative in 2022. And this is a federal program that has required all 50 states to develop their own plans for how to implement some of the formula money that's coming down the pipeline from the federal government. That's part of the bipartisan infrastructure law that was signed in the end of 2021. And that's really intended to deploy fast charging infrastructure on key corridors throughout the nation. And that's what this conversation today is really focused on. So the federal funds for EV investment, the 2021 IIJA, or the bipartisan infrastructure law, the NEVI program is a part of that. And I do want to mention that within this program, there are two kind of buckets of money. The first one is the NEVI formula funds, and every state is getting a portion of this federal funding, and North Carolina's is $109 million. So there's $5 billion available nationally over the 5-year program, and North Carolina is set to receive $109 million. There's a second pot of money that's called the NEVI discretionary funds. This is a competitive grant program that has yet to be released in terms of the notice of funding, so we don't know exactly what's going to be in there, but we do know that there's an earmark of about 50% of those funds should be available to help kind of bridge some gaps in the NEVI program and the actual fast charging infrastructure. So for example, if we had to bring power out to somewhere that was not necessarily covered under that program, or some transformer upgrades, things like that, that money is available. The other 50% of that is really dedicated, or intended to be dedicated, towards the development of a community grant program. Again, we don't know exactly what this is going to look like, but at the end of the day, $1.25 billion over 5 years for community-focused charging, and I know that a lot of communities are excited to hear that. So be on the lookout for that type of funding, or an announcement for that program at some point from the federal government. So the NEVI program is interesting because it really latches onto an existing program that's being run through FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration. And that program is called the Alternative Fuels Corridor Program, or AFC program. And so this is not just electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging. This also includes things like hydrogen, compressed natural gas, and propane. But what the NEVI program has done is kind of latched onto this existing program to say that chargers, as they are developed and built within the state, have to be within a certain distance from these corridors. And really the intent is to build out the corridors, the map that you see on the screen, with the fast charging infrastructure throughout the country. So really what we're looking at is North Carolina being a component of a much larger network of transportation and EV fast charging infrastructure that will support travel throughout the country. So if you're in North Carolina and you want to travel to Nevada, there should be the infrastructure there to be able to support that in an EV in terms of fast charging infrastructure. North Carolina's alternative fuel corridors, you can see that they crisscross the state. I don't think there's any surprise for where these are, but this just gives you a snapshot of basically the corridors that are nominated. And this is, I think, by round 6, this map is current. Which means this really is the palette that we have to work with for the development of fast chargers as part of the NEVI program within North Carolina. And we'll get a little bit more into those requirements, I think, on the next slide. But again, this is a snapshot, and I think important for everybody on the call to understand that the focus is going to be on building fast chargers along these corridors for the first phase of the program. And so there is a strategy to this. And if you kind of recognize these alternative fuels corridors as buckets, so what the federal government has basically said is once these are built out according to their standards, then any money that's left over as part of the program, that $109 million, can go towards community charging. And so this is what we're calling kind of phase 2 of the program. This is far out. This is several years from now. There's a lot of work that has to be done in the meantime, but it's something that is worth mentioning. So, as we build out these corridors, as we kind of fill up those buckets, then we can start dedicating some of those funding towards things like community charging infrastructure that doesn't necessarily have to fall into the same category as our fast charging infrastructure along corridors. There's a certain amount of leeway that can go towards the development of that infrastructure and how it can be built out within North Carolina's communities. So some of the key requirements of the NEVI formula program. I'll take a few minutes to talk around these. Number one, charging infrastructure has to be what I mentioned before, level 3 DCFC. Again, this is our kind of highest threshold of charging infrastructure that falls within what's called CCS. CSS, it's a charging requirement. Basically, it maxes out at 350 kilowatts. But essentially, this is what you would typically run into for something like a Tesla. Well, Tesla doesn't count, but a fast charging station along an interstate corridor. Chargers have to be located no more than 1 mile from one of these alternative fuels corridors. What they did with the NEVI program is it used to be 5 miles as part of the AFC, but then they've kind of reduced that to 1 mile. So as you're traveling, you really don't have to go very far off a corridor in order to reach one of these chargers. The chargers along those corridors can be spaced no more than 50 miles apart, which means somebody driving down a corridor, 1 mile from the corridor, 50 miles apart. These are the numbers that I think are key to understand. Charging must support up to 4 150 kilowatt chargers. That's the minimum per station. So to give everybody a kind of a little bit of a background, level 2 maxes out at 19.2 kilowatts. DC fast chargers generally start at 50 kilowatts. 150 is the minimum of these chargers. You can go higher and you can go more, but this is just kind of the baseline threshold, the minimum that can be built out according to program requirements. But it can go up to 350 kilowatts. So just to give everybody kind of a rough estimate of what we're talking about here. The formula program does require a 20% non-federal match. That doesn't necessarily state that it has to come from the state. It can come from the private sector. It can come from any number of sources, but the feds will cover 80%. That additional 20% has to be covered outside of the federal government. And that charging stations must be fully operational for a period of no less than 5 years and meet those NEVI requirements. And we'll talk a little bit about those later. But one thing I do want to make clear is that some of the folks on the phone might be familiar with the VW Mitigation Fund grants. That program was actually not classified as federal money, and this one is. So it does come with an additional set of requirements that are a little bit outside of what you would typically see with the VW mitigation funds. And we can talk through what some of those requirements are, but it is a different flavor than what some of the folks on this call might be used to. So again, I always like to say these are not your grandfather's chargers. The phase 1 for our NEVI program, you have to be able to charge 4 vehicles at 150 kilowatts simultaneously. The site itself, if you add that together, you're looking at 600 kilowatts total, which adds up to 20 miles a minute. And that's a similar load to, a 60,000 square foot grocery store. And when I say load, like the electricity load, the power load, again, just to give everybody kind of a rough order of magnitude. These chargers have to be non-proprietary. So right now, the Tesla superchargers don't count for that because those only work with Tesla vehicles. But if they do open it up in the future, that is something that would be applicable, and they have to be spaced no less than 50 miles apart. The phase 2 NEVI, again, potentially built for eventual compliance. If you were to build these along a corridor, you could have less chargers, you could have greater separation, greater coverage, or it could just be focused on kind of community-based charging off corridors. This part of the program, nothing's been really decided yet, and they're going to be looking, the North Carolina DOT is going to be looking for feedback after the AFCs are built out on how best to implement that program. So there's going to be a whole other process behind that to make sure that it kind of meets the needs of North Carolina's communities. So As part of the plan, some initial work was done to try and understand the locations of both existing and future DCFC chargers within the state. So the green locations are considered NEVI compliant stations along our existing AFCs. And then the blue icons are the approximate locations of future NEVI charging stations that are spaced out that 50-mile increment. This is not set in stone, and there's some different approaches that states are taking to make sure that these are spaced in a way that maximizes the utility of the chargers. There's strategies that you can employ to make sure that a charger potentially could serve 2 corridors, for instance, if it's at the intersection of a corridor. So I want everybody to recognize these are not prescriptive necessarily, but it's a start to better understand how many chargers, what the spacing might look like. But that's really what we're going to be working through. That's what we're going to be reaching out and talking to people, talking to stakeholders, and getting a better understanding of how this program can maximize the utility of those chargers along the corridors, and then to make sure that we get the full build out of the system in a way that kind of meets the state's needs and meets the federal requirements. Some of the goals that I did want to review in that the NEVI plan that was submitted on August 1st. These are high-level goals, but essentially we want to be able to build out an easily accessible EV charging network. We want to be able to increase overall network reliability. That's one of the big issues that we've seen with electric vehicle charging stations is just the downtime of those stations. And if you're relying on one of those stations for long distance travel, obviously it can't be down. It has to have a high degree of reliability to make sure that it's facilitating long distance travel effectively. We want to ensure that equitable distribution of the benefits of these chargers, particularly related to historically disadvantaged communities, is recognized. So this program is being held to what's called the Justice 40 initiative from the administration, the federal administration, which is to say that 40% of the benefits of the program should go to underserved communities. There's an online map that you can see, and I think we have a slide in here that shows where the locations of those are within North Carolina. And that's not even necessarily just the locations of chargers. That's also things like workforce development, who builds these out. So there's a lot of ways that you can quantify that to show that the development of the charging infrastructure is really serving communities in an equitable manner. We want to make sure that we expand access to economic and workforce development opportunities. Again, this is a fairly large program at $109 million, and I think it's a really great, I shouldn't say I think, but it is a really great opportunity to make sure that we're training up the workforce of the future that's going to be able to operate and maintain the charging stations. And as this technology becomes more widespread, this program can really be one of those defining features that helps to get this implemented in North Carolina in an effective way. And we want to make sure that there's reliability during emergency events. I had mentioned this before, but this is becoming more and more common. We don't want our transportation system to grind to a halt, for example, if there's a storm that takes out the power. So there's got to be strategies in place, and to make sure that there's redundancy in the system, and that the ability to charge a vehicle, the ability to move people away from the coast at certain times, the ability to move them back to the coasts at other times is going to be a really critical piece to that as well. So to give an overview of the process and schedule that we're looking at, we put together kind of a draft schedule, and I'll talk through these different phases and really how they all come together to get to the point where we're evaluating proposals and awarding contracts. So January and February of this year, at the end of January, we're going to be going out across the state and having a series of small group stakeholder sessions where the intent is really to listen. We want to listen to stakeholders. We want to better understand what is driving their decisions, what they would want to see in a program, what they see as some of the challenges, what they see as the opportunities, and basically just get feedback. And then with each one of those sessions, we are going to be having a public open house on the end of that to make sure that any community member that still has lingering questions or kind of comments about the program has an opportunity to engage with us. So that'll be, I'll describe that a little bit further down, but we have the specific dates and times for each of our cities. And we hope that basically everybody gets a chance to come out and speak to us, and we get a chance to listen. In February, we're going to be taking those stakeholder responses and kind of evaluating them and coming up with some of the, I guess, recommendations or some of the things that we want to carry through to make sure that they're well represented in that RFP. We are going to be developing and releasing an RFI, which is a request for information, and that's kind of an industry-wide to say, hey, let us know outside of these small group meetings, what is it we need to know as we develop this RFP. In March of 2023, you're going to be receiving the responses to our RFI, and we're going to be having more kind of community-focused engagement. So there'll be a kickoff that will allow additional community members from across the state to come in, and it's not just going to be this program. I think there's a broader engagement focus that's going to inform how this program and other programs are going to be developed. In April of 23, we're going to be evaluating those RFI responses. We're looking out to the future to say that there's the need for an industry forum and networking event, and that's where we can take different stakeholders, allow them an opportunity to get to know other stakeholders, and potentially form teams to be able to respond to the RFP. And then we want to be able to initiate that RFP development in April as well. So we'll start kind of building out those, the structure of the program, the structure of the RFP, some of the requirements, and some of the scoring criteria as well. In May of 2023, we're going to finish that RFP and basically issue a draft for comment. And then June to August of 23, we're going to be releasing that draft RFP with some of that feedback that was received initially, and then start to evaluate those proposals. So, this is really focused on the development of that RFP and trying to get respondents back and to be able to set up the stakeholders in the private sector in a way that allows them an understanding of what's coming down the pipeline, and allows them ample opportunity to be able to help shape the program in a way that is beneficial. So some key items to note. The process is going to allow the development of that RFP that's going to be a balance between federal requirements, North Carolina state goals, and at the end of the day, we want to make sure that it's an attractive return for the private partners that are going to be investing. As I mentioned before, this is considered federal funding, so it's a bit different than the VW mitigation. So this is going to be administered as a reimbursement program and must meet Title 23. And you can see the link there. If you basically just look up Title 23 through the Federal Register, it'll come up, and then 2 CFR Part 200. What that generally comes down to is requirements related to grants and workforce, and there's a lot of federal kind of requirements that must be met, and we're working through how those are going to fit in the program now, but be aware that this is a little bit of a different animal than those VW mitigation. The program structure has not yet been determined and is going to be informed by the feedback from stakeholders. What I mean by that is some states are going down the route of saying, we want to build out one corridor at a time, or we want to build out and fill gaps first, right? So kind of the bare minimum to get a network down. They might be looking to award a single firm some of these contracts, or they might be looking to basically piecemeal them out, or they might kind of bucket them into different tranches, or they might have different levels of funding available for different spots depending on the future utilization of those sites. Those are the kinds of things that I talk about when I'm saying program structure, and that has not been determined yet. And that's really going to be informed by the feedback that we get from the stakeholders through that RFI process and through the small group stakeholder meetings. And then the scoring criteria is going to be made available with the release of the draft RFP. That criteria is going to outline basically, how we're going to score all the responses that we get, and that's going to be in terms of the ability to meet federal requirements, state requirements, but also some of the features that we're going to be looking at that we won't go into in this presentation, but essentially it's, what are we getting for the funding that's available? And so those will all be made available, and everybody have a chance to form teams and base their responses off of those criteria. So when I say small group stakeholder meetings, the way that we've structured these is to be able to hit 4 different groups. The first is utilities, and that includes municipal-owned utilities, rural cooperative utilities, and then investor-owned utilities. So essentially, the folks that are going to be supplying power to the stations, we want to make sure that they understand what's coming, we want to understand where it's available, and we want to understand what their potential challenges are and make sure that those are kind of included and recognized in this process. We want to be able to talk to EV equipment providers. So those are companies or organizations that manufacture, supply, install, own, operate, or maintain that EV supply equipment, or sometimes called EVSE. Site hosts are any businesses or property owners that may want a public DCFC charger built and operated on their property. And then public open house is that anybody who's wanting to learn more or ask questions or discuss the NEVI formula program, it's going to be open to anybody that can come in and basically give their opinion and thoughts, and we look forward to that. So some of the key locations and times that we're in the process now of finalizing. We're anticipating that we'll kick off the process in Charlotte on Monday, January 30th. And so we're looking at 11 o'clock for utilities, 1 o'clock for our EVSE providers, 3 o'clock for our site hosts, and then the public open house would kick off at 5 o'clock. The same team will be available in Asheville on Tuesday, January 31st, basically the same setup in terms of times and groups to meet with. We will be in Raleigh on Wednesday the 1st, the same type of times. And then on Thursday and Friday, we will be in Greenville, and then we will be in Wilmington. So we anticipate that by this time, the EVSE providers are likely going to be well represented in the first 3 meetings and likely won't need quite as much engagement in Greenville or Wilmington, but it is an opportunity to speak with the utilities, the site hosts, and then to engage with the public at that point as well. One thing I do want to mention is that attending only 1 meeting is sufficient. So, once you're there, I don't think there's going to be a huge gap between what's being said in Charlotte versus Asheville. But again, we want to try and meet people where they are as best we can. So we're proposing this series of small meetings to basically come where you are and get the feedback that's really going to help us develop this program in a meaningful way. So the overview for our procurement process, we take the feedback from our small group meetings, we take the feedback from our RFI responses, and then we're going to be doing technical analysis as well. And we're going to develop that RFP, that request for proposals. From that RFP, we are going to have teams respond, and we will identify and select firms from that proposal and from the scoring criteria that's been provided as well. And that will lead to the construction of the infrastructure and operation for a period of 5 years minimum. So as far as the RFI is considered, the request for information, some of the respondents that we anticipate are folks like charge network providers, contractors and installers, EV equipment suppliers, electrical utilities, site hosts, nonprofits, consultants, and anybody else that might have a vested interest in providing information to the DOT to get the program or to inform the program to make sure that it gets implemented in a way that is consistent with the market. So again, this will be released in February. It'll basically be an email blast to make sure that everybody's aware of it, and then it'll be, I believe, posted on the website as well. But we'll have some more information about how that specifically will go out a little bit later. The development of the RFP, the request for proposals. So this is going to build on the NEVI development plan, including things like stakeholder engagement and the RFI process. And then NCDOT is going to develop the RFP to implement the NEVI program. It's going to be to develop that compliant EV charging station network. The RFP is going to seek proposals from industry participants. Basically, it'll be, understand this is going to be mainly a private sector initiative in terms of who's going to build, own, operate, maintain, and locate the charging. And the DOT is going to be the one that is facilitating that and to make sure that it's built consistently with state goals and with the federal requirements of the program. And then selected firms are going to be responsible for the construction and ongoing maintenance and operation of those stations. So the RFP is going to highlight the structure of the program, that scoring criteria, the process and conditions for the evaluations of those proposals, and then term sheet, draft contract with relevant commercial, legal, and technical and financial terms and conditions. So that's really the end goal for this particular process that we're looking is to develop that RFP and then to assist the DOT in kind of the scoring criteria and the identification of contractors to be able to build it out. There are some requirements that are pending from FHWA. They issued a notice of proposed rulemaking, and they have yet to release the final rules. But we have a sense of likely what's going to be in there, and that NPRM is available online for anybody who wants to see. There is an ongoing question about Buy America, because these chargers within the legislation had to be Buy America compliant. But one of the issues that I think the federal government recognizes is that with 50 states going out to buy chargers all at once, there might be some time needed to spool up domestic capabilities to produce that many chargers. And we still don't know necessarily about that discretionary grant funding, but we hope that there's going to be additional guidance coming from FHWA soon to give everybody, I think, a better understanding of how that program is going to function and what we can be on the lookout for. So when we look at possible station locations and opportunities for market participants, I think this is what's going to interest, hopefully, a lot of the folks on the call. I'll just give a reminder, this is the map of the alternative fuel corridors within North Carolina, and those chargers for this phase of the program essentially have to be built along this network up to 1 mile away from each one of these corridors. But that does limit the number of site hosts that could have properties available to build out the infrastructure. So you have to be kind of near the corridor. You can't be more than 1 mile away from the corridor drive time. So that means 1 mile away from an interchange for one of these corridors. And so it is limiting in some sense, but these are some of the locations that are likely going to have existing development, such as fueling stations, restaurants, things like that. And we anticipate that a lot of those folks are going to want to be involved in the program. Some of the potential NEVI funded DCFC locations. So the question is, what is a suitable location and where can stations go? Well, number one, we have to make sure that there's power availability. So that 600 kilowatts has to be available on the site. And that's where the utility engagement comes in. You got to make sure that the power is reliable as well. We have the question about the distance to the NEVI station. So that's part of our task, is to try and develop a process that allows, I think, some flexibility from the private sector to find site hosts and partners in a way that kind of matches your business model, but also meets those 50-mile requirements. So obviously we can't have stations that are built 55 miles apart, because then we have to add an extra station there, right? We want to be able to maximize those federal dollars and build out the program. So we want to get it as close as possible to those 50 miles, but also recognizing that our interchanges and our cities really weren't designed in such a way to meet those NEVI station requirements. So, it's a balance to try and figure out the best way to implement this, and the best way as well to serve long distance trips. As I mentioned before, this program is really intended to, fill that gap for fast charging infrastructure and serve long distance travel. So part of that is understanding where long distance trips are occurring and making sure that the infrastructure is set up to be able to support that. There's another piece to this as well, is so suitable is one question, but then priority is another. Where are they most needed? So again, distance to other stations is one thing to recognize. It doesn't do a whole lot of good to build one 5 miles away from an existing station, right? We want to make sure that there's a build out throughout the entire network, and that's spaced at the kind of maximum distance of 50 miles. Rural areas, I'll be honest, they're a little bit of a challenge because there's just not as much development. But at the end of the day, those are going to be those are the gaps that we really need to fill to make sure that there's those kind of infrastructure that's being placed throughout the network, throughout our corridor network. And then the Justice 40 designation. This is something that has to be recognized both in terms of rural and urban Justice 40 communities. It doesn't have to necessarily have a charger placed there, but to make sure that there's a quantifiable benefit of at least 40% of those chargers should go to those communities, and we'll work to fully understand how that can be done. This is one area where FHWA has not provided a lot of guidance on what they want to see. They're kind of looking for states to come up with ways to be able to quantify that and to be able to implement the Justice 40 with kind of recognition that it's going to be different state by state. So this is the alternative fuel corridor that's laid over our Justice 40 tracks. You can see from the legend below that the census tracks, the kind of light gray, light green area, those are the ones that are all over the state, and then the ones that are a more green color, those are the ones that are adjacent to a alternative fuel corridor. So some of these areas are communities that we do want to focus on because they're adjacent to the corridor. I think there's a good opportunity to make sure that the charging is placed there, and that those communities are engaged, and that the workforce development opportunities are there. And then potentially in phase 2, when we go out and look at community-based charging, then the Justice 40 census tracts that are outside of the range of the corridors might have opportunities for additional charging infrastructure in their communities. So one thing to mention, and I need to make this as, it comes up a lot. North Carolina DOT, the state, does not intend to own, operate, or maintain these stations. Due to federal and state laws, chargers cannot be placed in rest areas because commercial activities are prohibited there. Which means if the state were to place a DC fast charger in a rest area, they would have to give away the power for free. And that is not necessarily something that, for a large program is going to be the best option. So states all over the country, this is the general way that the legislation was written, is that these chargers can go on private property, even though they're public assets. So private firms are going to be involved in things like the procurement, the contracting, the implementation, and the site selection. And we're looking at a capital cost. This is a range. This is a range that we've seen across the country, so this is not prescriptive necessarily, and there's a lot of variables that can move this up or down, but anywhere between 800,000 and 1.2 million per station. And that final cost is going to depend on things like the availability of power, any kind of site design features or layouts that need to be added, or any additional features that proposers want to add to their proposal. And that includes potentially additional chargers. It could include higher power chargers. It can include a number of features that we're going to be working towards the development of those for that scoring criteria. So right now, what can market participants do? How can you prepare? Well, the first one is that there's a plan that's available online. So you can check out NCDOT's existing EV infrastructure deployment plan, the NEVI plan. Familiarize yourself with the AFC corridor map that's available in that plan. It's also available online through the Alternative Fuel Corridor FHWA program. You can go on, there's a GIS link, and you can kind of zoom in a little bit and see specifically where there's exits and things like that. Please participate in the small group stakeholder meetings and the industry engagement opportunities that we're going to be putting on. Start identifying teams if desired. Don't have to, but it's an opportunity to be able to find suitable site hosts, folks that can own, operate, or maintain this infrastructure, and then attend the partnering forum that we're planning for April of 2023. So when we look at some of the respondents that we anticipate, or some of the teams, you're likely going to have site hosts, utilities potentially, maintenance providers, equipment suppliers, equipment owners. That's not to say that this has to be the bulk of it. It can, the team can be made up by any number of participants, but this is kind of a snapshot of some of the folks that we've typically seen in other areas. So for site managers and owners, the question is, do you want to host or own or operate a DCFC station? It is a public asset, so you have to have the ability for the public to come there. It has to be open 24 hours a day. If you have kind of a locked gate, or you're uncomfortable with people coming to use a charging asset in your parking lot, might not be the best option. But if you want to attract people that are going to be sitting for a half an hour, if you own a restaurant, if you own a fueling station, if there's any other kind of use that would benefit a traveler, might be a good option. Is your site within 1 mile of an AFC? And then can your site help meet that 50-mile spacing requirement? Fortunately, if there's one already built and your site is a mile or two from that, it's probably not going to be a great option. But for those that might be 40 or 45 miles away, start to consider it. We do want to mention that there are different models for ownership and operation to explore, and these can be structured financially, operationally, and maintenance-wise in a variety of ways. There's not one set way that teams will come together. There's not one set way that this infrastructure is going to be owned, operated, financed, maintained. And we look to the market participants, we look to the private sector to really develop that in a way that is beneficial to the state and to the program, and then to the communities that these pieces of infrastructure are going to serve, and travelers, obviously. So I'll wrap this with saying that some of the next steps that we anticipate, this presentation is really our initial introduction to this process. This is intended to provide kind of some baseline knowledge for the folks on the call, for the folks that we're going to be meeting with in these small group meetings, and for industry stakeholders, the general public, to understand kind of large scale how this process is intended to unroll. We would like you to reach out and meet us in person at these meetings that we're going to be holding around the state. We are going to be sending out invitations and RSVPs for this meetings to the listserv. So if you join this presentation because you signed up for the listserv, that's available online. And if you use the QR code, it'll take you right there as well. Put your email address in, and we'll basically send out invitations, and there will be a jot form that allow you to go in, RSVP to any particular meeting. You can tell us kind of which one you would be interested in, utilities, EVSE providers, site hosts, and then the general public will be kind of a separate one that we're gonna blast out by location. But for stakeholders, please go in. Please let us know if you intend to come, so we can make sure that there's enough space and who you expect to see those attending. And then if you can visit the NCDOT NEVI webpage to enter your email address, we'll make sure that those get out to you, and feel free to forward it on to whomever you would see fit. So with that, kind of concludes our presentation, and I'm actually a little bit ahead of time, I can see. So I'll get Jen back on the line and see if we have any questions, I guess, that need to be answered right now, or any kind of wrap up thoughts before we conclude our webinar.
Yeah, fantastic, Justin. I am so impressed that you got that done in an hour, because it probably would have taken me an hour and a half. I have been frantically answering questions as they've been coming in. I think I caught most of them. There were a few that came in that were probably a little bit more specific that I might answer offline. But one of the things I want to mention is all the questions that you are asking are just fantastically helpful as we're starting to put this together. I think as Justin's made hopefully very clear, this is the time for feedback. These are the questions we want to hear. As we are starting to build this RFP, we want to hear your feedback. And so the questions that you've asked, we're definitely going to take to heart. But please come to all of the roundtables that we're offering throughout the state and continue to ask these questions. So as Justin just said, this is just the start of it. We're just kicking it off. We want to hear all of these questions. So please bring them. We've recorded all of them. I think I've responded back to most of them, but please keep them coming. And we really, really look forward to seeing all of you the week of January 30th through February 2nd. So I want to thank you all very much for your time today. Justin, fantastic job. Thank you very much for leading this and for the great presentation. And again, please feel free to reach out with questions. You should be receiving an email by the end of this week with the next steps that will include the locations and the times and a registration link for how you can attend those different stations, as well as a link to this recording. And please feel free to pass it along to colleagues or others that you think might be interested and couldn't attend today. With that, I think we can give you back 13 minutes of your time. And again, really appreciate all of you attending today and look forward to working with you on this. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.